It's this enormous distortion in my mind of what the state can and should be. Instead of investing in this complex apparatus of lending, let's just invest in education. Let's just fund what we need.
Hello, I'm Guido.
And I'm Waleed Shahid.
And you're listening to Bloc Party, a show about the fight for the soul of the Democratic Party. Movements, going on strike, negotiating with presidents who may or may not have the legal authority to give strikers what they want. But first things first. Waleed, have you gotten your stimulus check?
Brah, brah, brah. Yeah, I did. And my rent day is the 15th, and then I got the check on the 16th, and then it just went into the rent.
$1,400 from the IRS in the direct deposit. It's the third week of March 2021. The big Biden stimulus bill is beginning to hit people's bank accounts. $1.9 trillion going into the economy. Is it going to be big enough to rapidly get down the unemployment rate, get Americans out of poverty in this crisis?
People need to remember that things were bad before the pandemic, and things were bad before Trump, too. And that was like what we had a whole presidential primary about in our party. And so they are shooting money at the right things in the stimulus, but there are many more things that the stimulus will not take care of. From the climate crisis to wage stagnation and...
You inject $1.9 trillion into the economy, and I'm like, man, that's a big number. And then I start working on next week's episode, and I'm like, you know what else is a big number? $1.7 trillion in student loan debt.
Oh, wow. I didn't know the numbers were so similar.
I know. It's like, put 1.9 in, but then we still got this weight, this dragging you down. Can't buy a house, don't want to get married, don't want to have a kid because you're paying student loans.
You should use I statements, Guido.
All right, man. Hey.
There's something in the stimulus that might be a signal that Democrats are serious about moving towards some form of student loan cancellation. And AOC explained this on IG Live just a few days ago. Here's AOC.
Now, before everyone gets ahead of themselves, there is not student loan cancellation in this bill, but there is a provision that feels like an Easter egg. There is a tax provision tucked away that says if your student loans get canceled, that cancellation, you don't have to pay taxes on that cancellation.
Kind of similar to what they did with unemployment benefits, where if you got unemployment in 2020, now you don't have to pay taxes for that in 2021.
So this provision that's tucked in, I think tells us, like, if you care about student debt cancellation, it's go time for you. You need to mobilize, and now is the time to organize, to create the political pressure.
But there's still a question of how much in general is going to be canceled. I mean, people have tens of thousands of dollars in student loan debt.
Right, and last spring, during the pandemic, congressional Democrats passed a bill that would cancel $10,000 in student loan debt. And this was after a primary where you had a lot of debate about student debt. Bernie Sanders wanted to cancel pretty much all student debt, and Senator Warren had a plan to cancel $50,000 of student loan debt, but then phased out the benefits for people who are making above $125,000 a year. And the Democratic nominee, Joe Biden, committed to $10,000 in cancellation, which is what the House Democrats had proposed.
Damn. So we're only going to get 10K?
I don't know, man. Something happens between 10 and 50 where it becomes unconstitutional. I can't explain it. It's witchcraft. But what AOC is saying is the fight is not over because Democrats seem to be preparing for some level of cancellation by including this stipulation in the stimulus.
Yeah.
Senator Warren and Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley, squad member, proposed a resolution in Congress this year, in early February, that would cancel up to $50,000 in federal student loan debt for federal student loan borrowers.
And that's me, a federal student loan borrower. And experts say that if you canceled 50K of that, you would eliminate all student loan debt for 36 million Americans. So a big chunk of the 1.7 trillion gets wiped out.
But why leave 9 million federal student loan borrowers who have tons of debt with a little less debt? If you're trying to boost the economy, you're trying to undo the damage of the debt. Why? Why?
See, because you were like, something happens between 10K and 50K that Biden just can't abide. And I don't think it's a legal thing, because we talk about the legal stuff in this episode. I don't think it's that. It gets to a question that we've just been talking about on the show, which is, how do we make sense of the Biden presidency? Is it just going to be a continuation of Clinton-era, Reagan-era neoliberalism, or is it going to be more of a break? And where is it going to be a break? And we talked about some of those breaks with that era in the American Rescue Plan last episode.
Yeah, Democrats spent $1.9 trillion after a presidency where they were scared to spend over $1 trillion in the Obama presidency. And they're cutting child poverty in half. Biden directly repealed the same punitive work requirements that he voted in as a senator in the 1990s. He canceled himself on the child tax credit.
That's right. Biden canceled himself and Bill Clinton on the child tax credit. But I think on debt, Democrats of his generation still think of debt as an individual decision. It's like you're taking on debt because you're making an investment in yourself, and that investment pays off because of higher education. And because it's an individual thing, it's like, come on, man.
Come on, folks.
I think the only way that Biden would do more student loan debt is if he becomes convinced that canceling debt is actually about righting a wrong that millions of Americans have suffered because of. I realized that talking to our guest this week, Astra Taylor, a documentary filmmaker, an organizer, and a writer. Her recent films include What is Democracy and You Are Not Alone.
The banger.
She has been organizing around student loan debt since Occupy Wall Street. Since then, she's written books about democracy. She's written books about the internet, the People's Platform. But this whole decade, she has been organizing with the Debt Collective, which is a union of debtors. Now, there is a group of organizers on debt strike. 100 debtors are not paying their student loans and demanding that Biden cancel all student debt beyond $50K. And I talked to one of them. I talked to Umme Hoque, the organizing director of the Debt Collective, who's on strike right now.
I think you're right that Joe Biden does, in his constitution, in his core, kind of thinks of student debt as an individual problem, individual choice. But I think what you're going to hear in this interview is that that is not what happened at all.
It's definitely not like 45 million Americans woke up and were like, you know what I should do? I should take on a lot of debt. No, we changed the way that we finance higher education. But anyway, that's in the interview.
All right.
Waleed, see you in the outro. First up, I talked to Astra about the history of student loans. Then I talked to Umme Hoque about the debt strike and the demands on Biden. And then Astra comes back, and we get to talk a little bit about organizing and storytelling and what roles they play in movements. Enjoy. We're back. Our first guest today is a documentary filmmaker, organizer, and writer. Her recent films include What is Democracy and You Are Not Alone. She's also the author of several books, including Democracy May Not Exist, But We'll Miss It When It's Gone, and The People's Platform. And she co-founded the Debt Collective, a union of debtors going on strike demanding cancellation of student debt. Astra Taylor, welcome to Bloc Party.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for being here. Astra, it's finally March 2021. Your eyes got very wide. We're all reminiscing about the last things we did before sheltering in place. And I'm guessing that one of the last times that you were in a room filled to the brim with other people, talking loudly over each other, was when you gathered organizers and scholars into a room to discuss debt and debt strikes and recorded it. Is that right? Is shooting You Are Not Alone one of the last things you've done with people in the real world?
It really was. It was February 7th, and that day stands out to me because a few months ago, it was revealed that this was actually the day that Donald Trump was interviewed by Bob Woodward, and he actually was talking about the coronavirus and saying, oh, this virus is airborne, Oh, wow. So February 7th, 2020, little do we know that that's happening. Yeah, I gathered with members of the Debt Collective and with some academics that we really admire and some activists to have a group discussion about debt, education, and liberation, and I filmed it.
The university only gets about 20% of its budget from the state now.
Wow. UC gets 12%.
Yeah.
13.
Yeah, we used to get 15, now
so
we
what
get
you're
20.
saying is it's not public.
Yeah, it's not funded by the government. It hasn't been for a while.
So who funds it?
You do. Your debt does.
Tuition.
So it's only public if you get money I mean, you're a public school but getting private money?
Yeah.
A public university means you're not paying tuition.
Okay, but
Sounds
it's...
like the term public doesn't stand for what it should stand for.
Right.
When I was watching You're Not Alone, I was thinking about how we're approaching this 10-year anniversary of Occupy Wall Street, this movement that the Debtors Collective grew out of. That anniversary will be in September of this year. In the decades since then, you've written philosophical meditations on democracy and self-rule. You've written about culture and democracy on the internet. But debt and student debt has also been maybe as much as a consistent through line in your work as democracy. Why?
Yeah, so if we flash back to Occupy Wall Street, indeed, almost 10 years ago, part of what was so striking about it is that it was a movement of debtors. We didn't necessarily know that when we answered the call to Occupy Wall Street. We were in the middle of a financial crisis of epic historic proportions, and the people who had been organizing to that point were the Tea Party. The right-wingers were saying, this is a crisis, we need to shrink the state in response. So finally, years later, the left was organizing and doing something. And so I felt, well, I have to come and support this.
A block away from Freedom Tower, which is literally rising from the ashes of Ground Zero, down the street from the New York Federal Reserve Bank, Zuccotti Park, home to the Occupy Wall Street encampment.
Protests against Wall Street gained new momentum today, with union members and students joining in. A crowd that numbered several thousand or more jammed the rally site, Foley Square.
So I just wanted to tell one story about Occupy. It's the second or third day, and I heard this voice across the park, and he said, step right up and write down what you're worth to the 1%. And I felt this kind of chill because, you know, it was like, wow, if I do that, I'm going to have to write down how much I owe, like how indebted I am. And that's kind of a painful moment, like to actually put that number on paper. And I looked, and other people were doing it, and it was amazing to me to see these people with huge numbers, right? Negative wealth. I owe $120,000 in student loans. I owe $80,000 in medical bills. And so I went up and I wrote down I owe $42,000 in student debt. But what was interesting was that framing, which I just didn't use, right? But it wasn't just what do you owe, it's what are you worth? So what he did in that moment was show me that my debt was somebody else's profit, right? That it's an asset, it's not an accident. And so I was part of a group that sort of recognized, hey, wow, we could do something with this. Like even if the encampment ceases, and it's going to, the encampment was never gonna last forever. The drum circle had to end, sorry.
I'm just interested because you told this story about writing numbers publicly. Did you feel shame about your defaults? How did you think of yourself as someone with student debt before or after Occupy?
I understood my debt politically, but there was no movement for me to connect my political understanding to. So I remember the day I defaulted and I got the phone call and they said, you defaulted, so now your principal is going up by 20%. So suddenly I owed 20% more.
What is a principal?
The principal is the amount of money you owe, right? It's how much, it's sort of the core amount, and then interest and fees compound on that. So I went overnight from owing, $30,000, and then when I couldn't pay, they said, well, now you owe $40,000. And I was like, this is not logical. The problem is I can't pay. So, what happens when you default is that your credit's destroyed and all of this. Now, I understood when that happened that something was wrong with the system, right? And I knew that my grandparents' generation and parents' generation had been able to go to college for basically free or much less. And I understood personally, I felt, wow, this debt is kind of a form of social control, right? I have to work so hard to pay it off that I can't really do what I want with my life. But it didn't matter that I was thinking these thoughts because I didn't have anyone to share them with. I didn't have a movement. I didn't have a space to discuss these feelings. And so I felt mad, but I also felt like this weight, the burden of my debt and my default and the fact that it was having these financial consequences. Well, what Occupy did was it brought me into community, right? I saw, as I wrote that number on the page, that there were lots of other people in the same boat. So that's our slogan at the Debt Collective, you are not alone. And we spell alone, A-L-O-A-N, but it's a double entendre. In other words, your situation is not individual, it's systemic. It's the fact, again, that you have to debt finance individually what should be the basic public provisions of social life. But shame is a huge part of indebtedness. So one thing we're trying to do is overcome that shame and stigma. It's part of the ideology of capitalism. It's like, oh, you're poor because you made poor choices, not you're poor because we live in a society where wealth is intensely concentrated and you don't have social services.
In your mind, looking back at history, when are the seeds of the current student loan crisis planted?
The seeds of the student loan crisis, without a doubt, were planted in the 1960s in California when a man named Ronald Reagan was the governor. And
runs for governor in 1966 and wins.
He wins. And how does he win? Well, part of how he built his brand was by attacking student revolutionaries, student radicals. So we all know the cliche of the 60s, right? So in the 60s, the kids at UC Berkeley were protesting. And in California at the time, college was free. There was something called the UC Master Plan. It was basically education's a public good. It's free to all. Junior colleges, state colleges, and at these flagship universities. And that actually was in keeping with the spirit of the founding of many of the country's public universities. If you go back to the charters of many public universities, this is about educating the public for free so that we can have an educated citizenry and we can be competitive in the arts and in industry, et cetera. So free public education is an American tradition. Of course, access wasn't equal. So what was happening in the 60s was that the group of students accessing that education were diversifying, right? There were more Black students, more women, and the kids were getting political. And Reagan very consciously, drawing on the insights of neoconservative and neoliberal economists at the time, said, we've got to make these kids pay. There are quotes where he says, hey, if you're paying tuition, you're going to think twice about carrying that protest sign.
Quickly, I want to play a relevant clip from You Are Not Alone. First, one featuring the words of Professor Dylan Rodriguez.
To be very schematic and vulgar about it, right? When the UC system was a lot whiter, it was basically free. It fit the model of a public university in the sense that there was basically very minimal tuition. And that wasn't that long ago, 25 years ago, right? When it did not look the way it does now. It's almost inevitably, right? Becoming Black or brown or more working class. So at that point, the state starts to defund it so that we don't think about it as institutional war on working class people and Black and brown people. It gets turned into austerity.
And this tidbit about right-wing neoliberal think tanks from Professor Wendy Brown.
I wanted to also connect this to neoliberalism. It's important that what Reagan did in that moment was consult with a guy on the UCLA campus named Buchanan, and it was Buchanan who said to him, make them pay, they'll quiet down. He took that advice directly from a think tank, a neoliberal think tank, and put it into practice. And many billions of dollars later, we have a half-privatized public system with debt, with high tuition and fees, and with dying arts and humanities.
All right, keep going.
So it was a political project to put fees and tuition into the mix in California. And so I think we really have to take that seriously, that it was that imposing tuition and debt on students was part of a right-wing, reactionary, and racist political project. And now we just take it for granted. Like, well, of course you have to take out loans to get an education. That's not true. That's not how the system was built, and that's a political choice.
So one seed of the current student loan debt crisis is planted in 1966 by Reagan. And of course, that seed blossoms through the next half century, through the Reagan Revolution. But there's another seed that is planted actually in the Great Society legislation that's part of what Reagan is reacting to. There are all of these working class Americans, Black, brown, and white, who want to go to university in the 50s and 60s. There's still tuition costs that are low thousands, but that is restrictive for working class students. Private lenders don't want to give to those kids, so Lyndon Johnson, the Democrats, and the Great Society pass a Higher Education Act that tells private lenders, if the kids default, we'll guarantee the loan. We'll underwrite it. Is that right?
Yes, and so instead of democratizing access to education by increasing funding, what they do is they increase access to borrowing, right? That's the kind of compact, that's the bargain that's made. Lenders were not eager necessarily to jump into this market. And so what we have today is a system where 4 out of 5 student loan dollars are backed by the federal government.
And that system is created by the Higher Education Act of 1965.
Yes, exactly.
Tell me if you think that I am overstating this, but the more I read about this 1965 Higher Education Act, the more I felt like there's the contradictions of, on the one hand, the government is trying to expand access to a public good, but chooses to do so, as you're saying, the government still underwrites all these loans.
This is what neoliberalism is. This is the definition of neoliberalism, right? I mean, it's not that the state just disappears.
Right.
It's that the state is reformed so that it supports these private actors. What you have is the state, instead of it being the state's job to provide quality education to all of its citizens, you have the state's job is to be a lending institution and a debt servicing and debt collection industry. We talk about neoliberalism as being connected to financialization. It's the fact that instead of just providing services directly, now everything is wrapped up in these financial contracts and financial relationships. And so, this is why when the right's like, oh, we hate bureaucracy, it's a lie. It's like, because what this has done is created all of this bureaucracy that causes a lot of pain. I mean, student debt, part of the big problem is that because the government's the lender, it has tremendous powers of collection. It can garnish your Social Security, as I just said. It can garnish your tax returns.
Garnish meaning you default on your loan, so we are taking money that was like waiting for you in your Social Security account. We're just taking that to pay off the other loan you took out for school.
Right, exactly. And so, no tax return for you. We're going to keep that. And, if you need your tax return or you need Social Security, you are not rich by definition. In fact, if you borrowed to attend college, you are not rich by definition. So it's this enormous distortion in my mind of what the state can and should be. Instead of investing in this complex apparatus of lending, let's just invest in education. Let's just fund what we need directly. And again, that model is already with us. We also have the GI Bill as an example, which brought millions of veterans into higher education. And it didn't just improve their employability. There's lots of data that says they became more democratic citizens. They were more likely to participate in politics, more likely to run for office. I mean, there's all of these spillover effects.
Which is part of the problem for Governor Reagan and his friends.
Exactly.
Is that you are funding these loans, more people are going to college, more black students and more women are going to college. And that's why I think...
But the point is that in 1965, in the Higher Education Act, they also gave us the nuclear button to erase student debt.
Right.
Because when you have the ability to issue debt, by definition, you have the ability not to collect it. So the Higher Education Act basically gives the government the authority to not collect on the debt that it's lent out. And so that is why the debt collector has focused so intensely on student debt cancellation, because it's all owned by the federal government, and the federal government has the power already in its possession to cancel it all.
Yes, but that is not what the government has done over the past 40 years. And I think these two things happen almost at the same time. In 1965, we create a system where the government is underwriting private loans. In 1966, in Reagan's gubernatorial campaign, I think we're seeing the beginning of the fusion of anti-civil rights, racial resentment with the economic agenda that conservatives have had since the New Deal was passed, wanting to undo the New Deal, wanting to privatize and deregulate the economy.
Well, if the government is going to build the schools and buy the books, issue scholarships, make judgments, and exert pressure, what if one day that pressure is of a political nature not to our liking? Already here and there in our land, there are too many students that are studying from textbooks that devote a chapter to public welfare and not one line to Patrick Henry.
But that doesn't mean actually taking out the government as an underwriter for colleges. And that creates the conditions for cuts to public funding, which really ramp up at the federal level after Reagan wins in 1980, and then hikes in tuition. As tuition goes up and students pay more and more, the gap in spending is covered by these loans.
I just crunched the numbers and I realized that a student going to the University of Delaware, so that's where Joe Biden went to college, today, adjusted for inflation, a student pays $90,000 more to go and get the same degree that Joe Biden got, right?
Wow.
So, and the minimum wage was worth a lot more then. So even though this apparatus was put in place beginning in the 60s, it wasn't really used. So at the beginning, student loans were used to sort of pay for extra things, like maybe your housing, because Pell Grants at the time typically covered tuition plus, right? You could buy your books, and also the minimum wage got you a lot more. So you could work a part-time job as a college student and you could probably pay your rent and more. So even into the early 90s, student debt wasn't even really measured. It wasn't a problem that experts and economists felt was worthy of paying attention to. Flash forward to 2011, Occupy Wall Street, and we held a protest marking 1T Day, the day student debt surpassed $1 trillion. Today, it's ticking almost up to 1.8 trillion. So that's very interesting that under the Obama-Biden administration, we passed the $1 trillion mark, and likely under the Biden-Harris administration, we'll be passing the $2 trillion mark. In the background, what is happening, though, I think it's really important to zoom out and say what's happening is, again, wages are stagnating, unions are being crushed, and what workers are told, what citizens are told is the problem's you. You need to get a credential, and then you'll be able to get a well-paying job. Then you'll be able to live a dignified life. Then you'll be able to feed your family, right, and save for retirement. And there's this idea that the problem was the workforce and their lack of skills, as opposed to the problem being the fact that workers are treated like crap and underpaid, right? And so that's the mythos that's surrounding this crisis, because the problem is that you don't make good-paying jobs by just forcing people to get college degrees, right? You make good-paying jobs by rebalancing the power of labor and capital, by strengthening unions, by saying, hey, guess what? $15 an hour minimum wage, right? So that's part of what's driving this, is that you're seeing people who are poor, they're trying to, make their lives better. And then they go, oh, well, I guess the only thing I can do is enroll in college. So then suddenly the for-profit college sector booms and people are buried in debt. So what student debt is today is a kind of mobility tax on poor and working class people. So we know Black women are the most burdened by student debt. Why? Because of wage discrimination at the workplace, because of a lack of intergenerational family wealth, right? So what happens is that the very people who need upward mobility take on student debt and then get dragged down further into this financial hole and are most risk of default. So it's very perverse. And in that sense, it's exactly the inverse of the government lendings that happened in the New Deal era, where you saw the government backing mortgage loans for white families. Really, really low interest rates, government loans that built the white middle class, right? Gave them access to capital so that they could build wealth on fair terms. And that's what built the white middle class, access to government-backed credit. Well, you kind of see the opposite today with student debt. You see access to these predatory loans under the pretense of, upward mobility, but actually dragging a generation down.
I want to ask in some ways how cynical you are about the intentions of Reagan and conservatives in the 60s and 70s, because I think, as you're saying, like in mainstream discussions of debt, they would say, yes, you're taking out loans, the government's underwriting them, but this is so that, you have some skin in the game, you're gonna invest, but more people are going to be able to go to college because more people are going to be able to take out loans. That's going to create more innovation. All boats are going to rise. And people are persuaded by that. They're like, okay, I'm going to take out a loan because I'm going to make money. And that one way to understand debt cancellation is not just that it would benefit the economy now, but that it is actually righting a wrong, a policy failure that no individual is responsible for. The government chose to shift the provision of higher education to these loans, and you promised that it would make the economy better. It failed. You should right that wrong.
I mean, I'm absolutely cynical. The Reagan Revolution is an attack on women, on Black people, and on working class people.
And it is a successful one.
It is an extremely successful one. Ronald Reagan hated the student protesters. He hated the Black Power movement. But he didn't hate all protesters. He loved the property tax revolters. So in 1978, there was a movement of suburban affluent homeowners who basically said, we're not going to pay our property taxes, because they didn't want their tax dollars going to pay for schools and all these public goods, right? He thought they were great. He basically, supported this movement and rode that wave to the White House. That's actually what he built his presidential campaign on. And these tax revolts spread across the country. And those tax revolts are significant because they're actually sort of neoliberalism on the ground, right? So it's these rich, white property owners basically saying, yeah, taxes are theft and we don't want to pay for these public goods precisely because Black people, brown people, immigrants are using them, right? It was suffused with racial resentment. And so I think student debt cancellation for me, we can couch it in economic arguments. I think there's a lot of reasons that people who claim to want capitalism to work should cancel student debt because it will increase entrepreneurship and people will spend money in their communities. And why should the government be in the business of lending anyway? But I think it really is about the fact this is not just a policy mistake. It was an act of policy violence. I'm going to channel Representative Ayanna Pressley and say this was a conscious act of policy violence.
The decades of systemic racism and discriminatory policies like redlining and predatory lending that systemically denied Black and Latinx families the opportunity to build wealth, forcing our families to take on greater rates of student debt. We can and we must take bold action to address the inequities and disparities in our country. And that begins by confronting and unapologetically dismantling the generations of intentional policy violence, which has created these inequities to begin with. None of these inequities and disparities and racial injustices were naturally occurring. They didn't just happen. They were codified in law.
And people have suffered enough. And as an organizer, I see that suffering every day. I see it every day, man. I mean, people's lives are being destroyed because this is the magic of capitalism. If you have debt, because of fees and interest, that debt compounds, it grows, right? So you sink further and further and further into the financial hole. But if you have wealth, it's the inverse. Interest accrues and your wealth grows, and magically you're just living off of unearned income, right? You're living off of this magic money that just accumulates because you've got it invested in the stock market or whatever. And so I just see that weight, the weight of this debt and many other forms of debt dragging people down and making it so that, they dream. The people I organize with, they dream of having $0. That's the American dream today. Right? That's what it means to want to be out of debt, to be back to zero. And, I experienced debt cancellation because at Occupy, I was newly defaulted. I was angry. But then, I got lucky. My husband's a musician. We went on a rock and roll tour and he paid off my student debt. And, and my life is better. I paid off my student debt. My life is a lot better. I get to do what I want to do. And I want that for all 45 million student debtors in this country, right?
Astra's like, but that is not available to everyone. Not everyone can marry a rock star.
I know.
I'm lucky. I'm cool. I'm lucky. I married a rock star. But look, that's not what democracy is about.
But I had to get that lucky. I had to be that lucky, It's like, right? It's like winning the lottery. It's like, wow, okay, that, I didn't plan for that because really, my life is not geared towards making money. I want certain people to lose money and cancel debt. So it's like, I'm not a very good candidate for ever paying off my student loans on my own.
Well, we're going to talk to someone that you organize with, Umme Hoque, about what it is like to have debt and go on debt strike. And then Astra will be back with you for a few more questions.
Meanwhile, the push to convince President Biden to wipe out student loan debt for tens of millions of Americans is gaining momentum.
A coalition of Democrats is making the case to forgive up to $50,000 as a means of boosting the nation's economy.
College should be a ladder up. For too many people, debt is the anchor that weighs them down.
Welcome back. Our second interview today is with Umme Hoque, the organizing director at the Debt Collective, and a debtor who went to college in the United States and is now on strike and demanding that Joe Biden cancel
all of it.
All of it. Demanding that Joe Biden cancel all student debt. Umme, how are you doing today?
I'm doing okay. How are you today?
I'm in New York, which is half snow filled with dirt. And you're in New Mexico, and I think that you made better choices in this pandemic year.
I have to agree. New York is a beautiful part of the world, but come to New Mexico.
So, Umme, you're on debt strike right now with 99 other debtors in the first 100 days. And I'd like to start at the beginning. Why did you go to college in the United States?
Because I knew I had to. My family immigrated to the States from Bangladesh, which is a country in South Asia. They had just left after a civil war that made Bangladesh an independent country and also one of the poorest countries in the entire world. And so they truly immigrated here with the idea of starting a better life for themselves, for their family, for the future generations of our family and other Bangladeshi people. And so I feel like from the minute I was born, I knew that I had to go to college, I had to get a good job. I think it's a very South Asian joke, and maybe it crosses countries, but I was definitely either going to be a doctor, a lawyer, or an engineer. And those are three job types that definitely require higher education. I've had this in my head my entire life. So I feel like it was the minute I opened my eyes when I was like literally born, where she was like, you're going to be an amazing doctor, lawyer, or engineer. And I'm really looking forward to it.
It's kind of like a surround sound narrative from your mom.
Yeah, it truly was. And, you know, I was interested in different things and wanted to study, although it definitely kept coming back to doctor, lawyer, or engineer. All of those were obviously very amazing careers, which I think they would have really loved if I had done all three at the same time. But since that wasn't possible, being able to see how I could contribute in this world meant that, oh, if I want to get a good job, that means going to school. There's no way you could be a doctor, lawyer, or engineer without higher education. So I got my bachelor's in Texas, which is where I'm from. I'm from Texas. And I ended up studying mass communication and journalism and politics because I was more interested in that. And after that, I was working and decided to go back to school and actually try and figure out a way to do more good in the world. So I ended up going back to school, and I actually chose to go to a one-year master's program in the UK because I figured out it would be cheaper for me to do a one-year program in the UK than to do a master's within the country. I'd been out of school for a minute. I was like, it might be hard to get a scholarship, so I should do it this alternate way.
Umme, how did you feel about your debt? I'm interested in when it shifted from this is an investment I've made to a more political or historical understanding of why me and 45 million other people are in this situation.
So I think I had already started thinking about the political dimension of debt at that time, but I hadn't really started to understand it until after I went to the UK, which is where I got my master's and studied international politics and started to really learn from people overseas about different types of education systems. For instance, in the UK, where it is more affordable for people to be able to go, it's not really tuition free depending on who you are, but it's definitely not the tens of thousands of dollars that we anticipate in the United States. And then upon my return, I started working in union organizing with the Service Employees International Union in the first instance. And through that experience, started really getting to talk to a lot of different people right out of the global financial crisis about their experience. And started to realize that many of us were holding student loan debt, many of us doing different types of jobs that were definitely not what we went to college for. And it's just not something that people were talking about at the time in that sort of way of, why do we all have this? Why have we all accepted that it's normal for us to just be carrying thousands of dollars of debt and trying to pay that off, as opposed to like these other systems in other countries where people are able to have an affordable higher education or even a free one?
What were the answers to those questions that you found?
So that was about 10, 12 years ago, where I was like, oh, I'm truly not alone. I'm not the only person who was struggling and took on loans to be able to go to college. But if you graduate and are making less money because of your race or your gender or all these other systemic inequalities that exist in this country, it all just gets exacerbated so that the loans just become more and more for people who are really struggling. That dream of being able to then achieve, to be able to pay back my loans, isn't actually a reality. And the reality is that student loans are a way of penalizing poor people for wanting to achieve more. So similar to the way that people will get together in their workplace and say, let's take action on X, Y, and Z. We want more of a voice at work, or we want better working conditions. What if we actually brought debtors together? It's not an accident if 45 million people are suffering from something. It's not an anomaly. It's not about me or you or whatever. There's actually a larger problem that we've all uncovered. And so that's how I found the Debt Collective and why I'm so excited to be a part of it and so excited to be building this new type of union and this new way of us being able to come together and say, our debts don't make us, like, they're not shameful. They're not something that we should just hold ourselves. Our debts are actually a way for us to build power together. So that's why I've joined with 99 other debt strikers, each of us symbolically representing Joe Biden's first 100 days, demanding that he cancel not 10,000, not 50,000, cancel all student loan debt and actually build pathways so that we can move toward tuition-free college for all.
Before we get to the debt strike, the Debt Collective, I think some people don't know this, you have already won some victories from the Department of Education. Some debt has already been canceled.
There's been a number of different campaigns and wins that we've had. We've abolished over $1 billion worth of debt. And the primary ways of doing that have been through things like debt strikes and bringing people together, for instance, at Corinthian College, a for-profit school that was definitely scamming its students, bringing people together to refuse to pay their debts.
Borrowing the money and never got the education they were promised. Good evening, I'm Veronica Dela Cruz.
And I'm Ken Bastida. Tonight, the former students of troubled Fort 5 Julie Watts with their risky act of civil disobedience.
Mackenzie Vasquez never thought she'd still be wearing a waitress uniform 2 years after she enrolled to become a medical assistant.
I am far worse off than I was before I went to school.
She says pushy enrollment counselors at Everest College convinced her to borrow $30,000 to attend a 9-month program. A program she says was a joke.
I was getting taught by students who were there for a week more than me.
Unable to pay a required monthly fee, Vasquez was kicked out, but the school kept her $30,000 in loans. Now, 2 years later, its parent company, Corinthian Colleges, is no longer in existence, sued by both the state and the feds for predatory lending and false advertising to students like Mackenzie. So they're refusing to pay.
We're striking. We're not going to pay back these loans, and we understand the consequences.
Vasquez is one of the Corinthian 15, former students from across the country all taking a stand and demanding their student loans be forgiven.
And actually then being able to transform lives by getting those debts canceled.
The Department of Education handed down a major victory to the students of now defunct Corinthian colleges.
Secretary Duncan is exercising his authority so that any student who either attended Corinthian at the time of its closing or withdrew from Corinthian after June 20th, 2014, is now eligible for a closed school loan discharge.
Previously, we had built a tool where people could dispute their federal student loan debt issues. And that tool was used so much that the Department of Education has actually taken over the tool. It's on their website because they could see that it was working very effectively. And that was one of those where they were intervening and recognizing that there was a larger problem that they needed to address and take care of. And they had to be able to not only resolve those disputes, but cancel a large amount of those debts. But it really does depend on who is holding the debt as to the different strategies that we use to try and get them canceled.
What happens when you go on debt strike? Like, how do you organize a debt strike?
People can go on debt strike in many different ways based on how they feel most comfortable. Because as you flagged, like, it can affect your credit, it can affect all kinds of things related to your economic future. And one of the things we definitely want to ensure is that, you know, the people who are a part of our movement are taking action in ways that they feel comfortable with. So I'm on debt strike by simply refusing to pay my loans. And I haven't paid my loans since I graduated from graduate school in 2010. So it's been a while. And so for a while, I was only individually on debt strike, and it wasn't until I was a part of this movement where I have been with many others also united in debt strike and taking more of political action. And so my loans, I have just been refusing to pay them. They've been in forbearance for a long time as we've been taking on, you know, greater types of political action to try and get them fully canceled. Currently, right now, there's a moratorium on federal student loan debt. So in many ways, people are taking debt strike without even knowing it. And so actually just vocalizing that would make it more of a political action so that we could continue to build pressure. I think one of the things things that we saw in the presidential campaign last year was the fact that there was even a conversation around canceling some amount of student loan debt was because of the organizing by debtors. Even though it was a number that is too low, $10,000 is not going to support enough people to be.
That was Biden's plan, was saying I'll cancel up to 10K. Warren went up to 50K, and Bernie said cancel all of it?
Yes, yeah. And there's still conversations like that within the party around what that number could look like and how much it should be. I think the fact that we're even having those conversations is an indication that debtors getting organized and taking action in different ways is already working.
The Higher Education Act of 1965, that's the same act that you're calling on him to use. That's where you're saying he has the legal authority to do this.
Absolutely. And we've actually seen it used in recent history. So the last two presidents have used it, Trump and Obama both. And it's the reason why loans can currently be deferred.
When anyone pauses student loan payments, that's the same executive authority.
Exactly. Yeah. So they're already showing that they know how to use it and they know it exists. So it's really unfortunate that Joe Biden continues to waffle on whether or not he has the authority, because he does. And he's showing that he knows he does, because one of his first actions was to extend the moratorium, which is the same authority that actually gives him the ability to cancel student loan debt entirely. And so recently, after his town hall where he was like, oh, I don't know if I have this authority.
I'm prepared to write off the $10,000 debt, but not 50.
Mr. President, let me ask you.
Because I don't think I have the authority to do it by sign of a pen.
We did hear from Senators Schumer and Warren reminding him that he has it. Like, it's even known within the party that it is something that the president holds. And it's known within the party that this is something that is an incredibly popular policy position that would support so many people and impact so many communities, that it's truly just a question of why won't he do it and when will he do it?
I wonder what you either hear from more mainstream parts of the Democratic Party or more establishment policy people about why the Biden administration is unlikely to take the full extent of the actions that you are demanding.
I think Joe Biden actually outlined some of his thoughts in a kind of a muddled way at his recent town hall when he was asked about the $50,000 that was introduced by Senators Schumer and Warren.
Student loans are crushing my family, friends, and fellow Americans.
Me too.
The American dream is to succeed, but how can we fulfill that dream when debt is many people's only option for a degree? We need student loan forgiveness beyond the potential $10,000 your administration has proposed. We need at least a $50,000 minimum. What will you do to make that happen?
I will not make that happen. It depends on whether or not you go to a private university or a public university. I say to a community, I'm going to forgive the debt, the billions of dollars of debt for people who have gone to Harvard and Yale and Penn and schools. My children, I went to a great school, I went to a state school. Each of my children graduated from school. I mortgaged the house. I was listed as the poorest man in Congress for, not a joke, for over 30 years. But I was able to borrow, I bought a home I spent a lot of time working on, and I was able to sell it for some profit. But my oldest son graduated after undergraduate and graduate school with $136,000 in debt after working 30 hours a week during school. So I don't think anybody should have to pay for that, but I do think you should be able to work it off. My daughter's a
And I think that we could spend a lot of time unpacking those conversations. And we do. We talk about the reality of who has student loan debt, the fact that it's not people who go to Ivy League schools, the fact that most people who have student loan debt don't have families that could then mortgage and sell a house to be able to pay that off like Joe Biden was able to, because they're always trying to split debtors between people who should have that debt versus people who shouldn't have that debt, which allows that only certain people should have it canceled. All the data shows that the majority of student loan debt is held by communities of color and low-income people. A lot of them didn't graduate for college. That means that a lot of these same people are also the ones that are losing their jobs right now, losing their health care right now, and not finding opportunities that are going to be able to support them to be able to pay off student loan debt when they can't even keep their lights on and they can't even stay in their homes. And if we're going to have challenges like bills getting stuck in Congress, this is actually a way of Joe Biden being able to do something without having to deal with Congress.
This is a theme on Bloc Party, Umme. Every guest we talk to at some point tells us, well, because our political system doesn't actually translate the votes into power, here's a workaround that we have. And this week's workaround is the executive authority in the Higher Education Act.
If part of our responsibility as a society now is to support the president in finding workarounds, we will do that as long as it means that we can actually support our broader society and help the 45 million people who are terrified about their student loan debt.
You mentioned that communities of color are most burdened. I feel like there might be a specific shift happening. The unique burden that the student loan crisis has placed on Black communities, not accidentally, because who in the past 40 years after the civil rights movement is seeking higher education and access to greater opportunities for the first time, is the immense racial inequity in the student loan crisis, even though we know it hurts all of us, and me and other white Americans have taken on more debt than our parents did, but the debt that Black Americans hold has quadrupled over the past 2 decades, whereas for white Americans, it's only doubled. Do you think that the racial politics of the Democratic Party are in some ways providing a path to shift the debt politics, the politics around student debt cancellation more quickly?
I truly hope so. I think that if we do not look at student debt cancellation as a racial justice issue, then we are missing a large part of the conversation. Black women especially are carrying the majority of student loan debt, and these policies that were enacted that cut funding for higher education and forced more people to take on student loan debt at the same time that we saw more people of color going to school. And that meant more people of color taking on debt because we know that more white people at the time and currently as well had more intergenerational wealth and were able to afford to be able to go to school without debt. And that meant more people of color taking on debt because we know that more white people at the time and currently as well had more intergenerational wealth and were able to afford debt. If Joe Biden wants to be on the right side of history, he will cancel all of it because he will recognize all of the people who got him elected are calling for that.
There was a poll that recently came out that said 40% of Black voters would consider staying home if there's no action on student loan debt, which feels like a bombshell to me. But I'm wondering if as we head towards the 2022 midterms and there are the same questions about the turnout of the Democratic base.
If the current Democratic Party isn't thinking about how they're implementing solutions that really support the people that got them elected, and if they don't, the risks that exist there for people to just continuously lose faith in this political system that we live in and just think that regardless of how they vote or what they do every election, politicians will not listen to their voices.
Umme, if folks listening want to support the 100 debt strikers through Biden's first 100 days and beyond, or are interested in going on strike themselves, what can they do?
They should go to our website and check it out, debtcollective.org, and join the union, learn more about our vision for a world where we have college, housing, and healthcare for all, and join the fight because we're going to need all of the voices to really continue pushing this issue and hopefully win.
Umme Hoque, thank you so much for joining us on Bloc Party.
Thanks for having me.
That is something I'm also like endlessly grappling with that. Like my theory of why I make films and how it relates to organizing is always changing. I'm always in an existential crisis about it.
Okay, well, I wanted to ask you about
We have to have a different podcast.
Well, I think it's relevant because I just talked to Umme and I asked her about her story. Now I'm back with Astra. I was reading Anne Helen Peterson's recent article about student loan debt, and she starts by saying, after reporting on this for so long, I realized that in every individual story, there's a decision that you can pinpoint where maybe they could have turned another way and not gotten into so much debt. They don't listen to that guidance counselor. They don't take out the additional loan that their family takes on. And so even though as organizers, as filmmakers, we know that stories are maybe our most powerful tool for persuading, for communicating, I wonder if you have ever felt that at a certain point, do we need to start telling a narrative where structures, systems, the right wing, laws are the protagonists?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, when you're trying to tell a political narrative, it's tricky because a lot of student debt stories start with statistics. They start with $1.7 trillion of student debt and 45 million debtors. And, 45 million debtors is really abstract. Right. Or you could say 45 million debtors and their families who are also impacted by this debt. So, for me, the challenge, and this is a challenge that is threaded through my writing and my filmmaking and my organizing, is how do you convey the human element without it tipping into human interest? And even stories about structural racism or structural inequalities, I'm sometimes frustrated by them because the truth is these are structures, but there actually are individuals and stories. There are people up there who have names and addresses who should be held accountable, right? So in other words, like, structure is people, people making decisions and people perpetuating harms. So I guess that's the dialectic, right? Which is like we have to live in these two realms and not lose sight of one or the other. Because, as an organizer too, it is about connecting with people. Because if we're going to organize people and build mass movements, it has to really matter to people. There have to be stakes. There has to be the possibility of improving our lives together. And so in that sense, like, you can never lose sight of the personal. I try in all of my art to do that. I think a challenge too is like, how do you tell personal stories that truly are personal, where the person's not just like this kind of passive example of a social problem, but a person with agency. The personal choice I'm interested in is like, when do you make the choice to like join a movement? When do you make the choice to like do something about the problem that is hanging over you?
I wonder what it would be like for storytellers and organizers begin to tell more stories of the individuals at the top.
Yeah.
Because to me, the story makes more sense when you can counterpose Umme and what she experiences as an individual and Governor Ronald Reagan in 1966.
So Reagan's a great enemy because he's a kind of charismatic megafauna of evil, right? Mm-hmm. He's Ronald Reagan. We all know him. But the problem is that a lot of people who are in Biden's Department of Education right now helped create the student loan system. So, we have a lot of bureaucrats, a lot of officials, so not necessarily elected officials, but kind of career officials who helped create the system. Because again, the student lending system, even if the seeds were planted in the 60s, really came to fruition in the 80s and 90s and aughts. And a lot of people who helped build this lending system, they're not holding political office, they weren't elected, but they're still in Washington and there. And so I think this is something, the people on the other end of the story are kind of boring. This is a problem. How do you tell the story of the kind of capitalist complacency that's not Dr. Evil, right? It's just like this attitude of like, well, yeah, of course people should have to borrow. And of course people should have to pay their debts, right? It's like the dullness, it's the banality, I guess, right? Of this situation that we kind of just accept. It's the status quo. And we're like, okay, well, now we just have to uphold the system. And we're trying to break that, right? We're trying to say to this group of, now Democrats and say, hey, just because this has existed for your whole career, it doesn't mean it has to always be this way, right?
I was reading The Great Mistake by Christopher Newfield just to learn more about the history of the retreat from the public university. Mm-hmm. And he makes this point that was so helpful for me, that privatization is not just one formula or one policy. It's a common sense that pervades so much decision-making that is underwritten by some of these policies. Once the government is underwriting private lenders and you are thinking about expanding access to higher education by expanding private loans, and then banks realize that there's a profit opportunity in there, and then universities realize that they can just charge more for tuition and then compete with other universities in the market. Privatization acts much more as a common sense than a policy. And I feel like what you're saying is, it's boring, but it's boring in part because the bureaucrats are just swimming in this common sense that they don't even realize is constructed 40 years ago. We just assume that, this is always how we've thought about debt. It's your fault and you should pay.
Totally agree, and I love Chris Newfield. So he's a scholar who's really, I think, at the forefront of thinking about what public education needs to be. So he makes the point that is, I think, should be common sense, right? That we need public education, higher education that's not just free, but well-funded. So his whole thing is, let's make a floor of $20,000 per capita per student who attends, right? So we don't want to end up where, college is free, but it's underfunded. There's austerity. Everybody's an adjunct, right? And people are paid crap wages. And so I think he's brilliant. And what you've said is exactly right. We're trying to shift what is now common sense. And I think that's where stories are helpful, right? Like, by telling stories that challenge that status quo narrative, challenge that common sense. But we just have to be careful that our storytelling is coupled with power building, right? We just don't want to think that stories are enough, because they're not. I can't tell you how many times, people are invited to go and speak to Senate staffers or speak to the boring bureaucrats at the Department of Education and tell their sob stories. That's not empowering for the individuals, and it's not real power. So I think, you have to couple those things, building economic power, building political power, using stories to do that, to transform the common sense. And exactly to say, like, this thing that you take as so natural and just right is actually a recent invention, invented by people like Ronald Reagan. And I just want to be part of a left that is able to create a similar shift in consciousness. Like that would be my dream.
Astra Taylor, thank you so much for joining us on Bloc Party.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you again to Astra Taylor and Umme Hoque for joining us on Bloc Party. Folks should check out Astra's film You Are Not Alone, which is on YouTube, and folks should go to debtcollective.org. Check out what Umme is doing. As AOC suggested, it is time to mobilize.
You know what? This interview reminded me of a younger version of myself. One of my first political jobs, Guido, was I worked for Bernie Sanders in 2016. What a time. And
What a time.
I remember there was a big rally he was doing at, I think, Temple University in Philadelphia. And Bernie was not like as big of a phenomenon as he is today, but
these were like the huge rallies in fall 2015, where people are like, Bernie's gonna get 5% in Iowa. And then it's like, why did 25,000 people show up to see Bernie?
Yes, and I got a sense of that because when he was speaking at this university, there was a line, multiple lines around the block for 12 hours to go, that you could be first in line to go see him. And I remember attending the rally, and there was a moment where, the stadium is filled with mostly students and young people, and there's a moment in the rally where he says something along the lines of, you were told to go to college to get a higher education, and yet you were being shackled with student debt, but you did nothing wrong. I looked around at some of the people around me, and they like had tears in their eyes when he said this line about how you did the right thing, but the system is making you feel like you did something wrong. And it just made me think of how deep and broad debt, and student debt in particular, touches so many people in this country on a visceral level, because there's so much shame around debt being something that you did to yourself through a wrong decision or wrong choice you made. And Bernie really broke through that barrier for lots of people, and basically saying that you should have no shame for doing what you were told to do.
Yeah, and in terms of thinking about student loan cancellation as righting a wrong, we've got $1.7 trillion in student debt, and 90% of Black graduates, of Black students who go to post-secondary education have debt. That's crazy.
It's a decision we've made as a society to punish ourselves.
All right, that's the show. Our producer, Temple University graduate Becca Rose. Our mix engineer is Leslie Gaston Bird. Special thanks, as always, to Michael Catano and Amy Westervelt. Waleed, thank you again.
Thank you.
See you on the block.
Bye.